This episode of the Media Leader podcast was edited by our production partner, Trisonic. And if you're looking for podcast production support, we highly recommend them. Find them at trisonic.co.uk.
Advertising has this role now of sort of helping to provide civic infrastructure in a way, which is why I think we're positive about its long-term role in the future as well.
Welcome to the Media Leader podcast. I'm Jack Benjamin. Last week, WPP Media released its mid-year global advertising forecast report. As Kate Scott-Dawkins, WPP Media's global president of business intelligence and author of the report, said, the growth picture for advertising is actually quite buoyant, even in the midst of severe geopolitical and macroeconomic uncertainty. As the global advertising community descends upon sunny Cannes this week, including us at the Media Leader, deals will be cut, rosé will be drunk, pomp will be circumstanced. But ahead of all of that, I wanted to first take a look at where this industry stands after a deeply unstable first half of the year. I caught up with Scott-Dawkins last week to unpack the first half of 2026 and look ahead to the end of the year and beyond to consider some of the long-term implications for the state of our global media ecosystem. This is our conversation. I hope you enjoy. Kate Scott-Dawkins, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So longtime listeners of the podcast will know that for the past few years, we've spoken usually in December to mark the end of the year, look ahead to the next year, and discuss how macroeconomic trends are impacting the global advertising market. But I just couldn't wait until December this year because the first half of 26 has been pretty mental from a macro perspective. We had the U.S. attacking Venezuela, threatening to attack Greenland. We've had an Olympics. We're now having a World Cup. Scandals, political scandals are engulfing the U.S., UK governments, other governments around the world, I'm sure. But perhaps most prominently, the U.S. and Israel began a war of choice with Iran, which responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz. And that's massively disrupted the global energy market. We're now starting to see maybe spiking inflation, potential food and energy shortages this year and in 2027. And that's before we're even expecting the super El Nino later this year, which could possibly cause further instability to global markets. So all that has happened.
Well, you left out like all the model developments, like all the new ChatGPT models, ChatGPT ads,
yes,
Google AI, all the announcements. Everything's happening in the first 6 months of 2026.
Everything is AI now.
Yes.
Blue links, the 10 blue links are sort of disappearing, becoming less prominent, let's say, on Google. I mean, the way we interact with media certainly changed a lot in the past 6 months. So all this has happened, and yet WPP Media upgraded its global advertising expenditure forecast. You're now expecting 8.9% global ad spend growth to $1.3 trillion. That's up from 7.1% previously forecast. My question is, why and or how?
It's a good question. I will tell you, I described this to someone a while back as I was looking at these numbers as a certain amount of agita, right? Like you understand what's happening in the world. You understand that the lived economy, people at the petrol station or the gas pump, people buying food in the supermarket are not feeling like the world looks better to them, right? They're hearing the news headlines just as you read them out at the top of the show. And yet, unlike in previous periods of conflict and uncertainty, like previous Iran oil crisis in the 1970s, unlike previous times of armed conflict, we have some really strong engines of economic and advertising growth that are underpinning, sort of providing a floor for advertising growth that we didn't have before. And those are supporting really resilient numbers for the advertising industry. We have things like cross-border commerce. So we have China and now China plus one manufacturing countries that are sort of the world's factory. And even though consumer demand may be sluggish at home in China, they are finding growth in international markets and spending on advertising in order to do that. And so that enters international markets sort of regardless of what the economic picture looks like in those domestic markets. There's still money flowing in from those Asia-based advertisers. We also have, the AI investment story, right? We have new companies that are being created off the back of AI developments that are now spending on advertising. We have companies that are applying AI-driven efficiencies into potentially more spending on advertising, more working media spending from efficiencies found elsewhere. And you do have just the engine, and we upgraded the US by even more. We're now at 11.9% growth for the US. It is the locus of a lot of this AI investment. It is actually driving up GDP growth. There is a sense of growth, energy, a race. I liken it to the gold rush, really, in the report. This sense that we have to get there first before anyone else. And so that also drives confidence. And the third thing is increasing concentration in media owners. So they're able to continue to grow at double digits quarter after quarter. They can take weakness in one sector and, it's offset by strength in another, or weakness in one market is offset by strength in another. And so they've been able to continue growing, showing results, applying AI optimization within their own business, and hence we have a 2 percentage point upgrade.
I want to unpack all of those. I will say something I do appreciate about all of the reports that you always do put a theme onto the report, which is not something that every global advertising expenditure report bothers to do. So you mentioned this mid-year theme is the gold rush. You compared sort of our current time to the California gold rush around 1849, Manifest Destiny at that time as well. Can you explain some of the similarities between those two eras? Because I think a lot of people today would look back on the gold rush and Manifest Destiny in particular and say maybe that wasn't the best thing in the world that happened, but it did happen and it caused a lot of social change.
Yes. So let's talk about some of the similarities first, and then some of the points about how we can do it better this time, I suppose. I'll say, or not repeat the mistakes of the past. We have this singular moment where, again, it's that sort of sense of a race of needing to get there, right? There are currently AI labs kind of with this inevitability, right? This is the Manifest Destiny link most closely. AI labs saying, well, of course we're going to get to superintelligence. We have to get to superintelligence or AGI. It's to humanity's benefit, right? That kind of certainty, as I was thinking about this report, just reminded me of that destiny type of sentiment that was present with Manifest Destiny, right? The sense that, of course, the U.S. would span from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Now, move on from that, we talk about the gold rush. It was an immense economic change for the country, for California. You had extensive capital expenditure into things like the Transcontinental Railroad, canals. We had improvements in agriculture technology, railroads and mining technology. And that feels a bit similar to the growth of data centers and electricity grids and all of those capital expenditures that we're seeing right now. Now, a lot of those innovations that came to the U.S. came from Chinese immigrants, from Native Americans who were working at this time. And their treatment, the outcome for them was not good. And we cite a couple of examples in the report, quite deplorable. I think we are at this stage a more globally aware, globally connected group of humans. We can look at the past and understand that was a cost too high, right, for Manifest Destiny and the gold rush. And so the thing is, knowing that, let's not repeat mistakes with this sense of, but of course we have to get there, and we have to get there at any cost.
Well, I appreciate some level of optimism that you have that we won't repeat the mistakes of the past. Something else that happened during the gold rush, I mean, it made a very small number of people extraordinarily wealthy, but that wealth did not necessarily trickle down to everyone else that had moved to California or to the West in search of gold. In terms of fewer, bigger winners, I think we see this basically every time we chat. I ask you about media consolidation. The latest report found that the top 5 advertisers comprise 58% of the global ad market. Those are Google, Meta, ByteDance, Alibaba, Amazon. Listed them in conversation before. The top 25 sellers comprise 3/4 of the ad market. And Your report notes that this is one of the big drivers of continued ad market growth, that media consolidation has been a benefit to the overall global ad market. It is helping, as you mentioned earlier, some of these big companies can still earn revenue in one market versus another. They can offset losses in different ways, but also none of the top 10 anymore are quote unquote traditional media owners. So it's mostly tech, social, retail media companies. Do you think that's healthy for advertisers, not necessarily just for the growth picture?
I think with anything in business, there are trade-offs. Yeah. So to some extent, for multinational advertisers, it can be useful to have a single platform with standard sets of campaign tactics and types and taxonomies and all the rest of it, right, where you can take learnings from one market and apply into other markets because it's all the same platform. And then there are trade-offs to that with potentially your leverage or scale versus what the entire company is taking in, right? That's looked quite different for several years from local or regional media owners to these big global platforms. That's not to say that we continue at this pace forever. I think one of the interesting things that we try to bring out in the report is just how much more important advertising is to the global economy today than it has been in the recent past. We expect that to continue, right? So advertising as a share of global GDP. I like looking at it at a global level. I don't like looking at it on a market by market level because the cross-border activity is just so high right now. But at a global level, I think that's really interesting, right? Advertising is a revenue model for these companies that are providing lots of digital services for consumers today, right? And so with such an attractive industry, I think we see more people come into it, right? And we saw that with retail media. We saw lots of retailers beyond these top 25 coming in. Now, some of them scaled and grew. Some of them are now in the top ranks. Some of them aren't, and that's competition, and that's fine. And we may see that there are other new sectors or categories of companies that come in to offer advertising that aren't, these current ones, and we continue to see competition. So it's an open question. I think some of it will depend on where the regulatory environment goes from here. I think there is a sense of how big is too big for this industry and for the tech industry more broadly. So we'll get into that. But again, trade-offs for any of those, I believe.
You mentioned regulation. By the time this episode comes out, all the reporting here in the UK suggests that the UK will become the latest country to ban social media for under 16s. It's likely that will have happened by the time listeners are hearing us speak. So given how much of the ad market growth is being driven at the moment by platforms which are, as the report notes, able to earn these massive margins because they aren't required to pay for the content that they're hosting on their platforms, on their websites, apps. What might happen long term if platforms are required to act differently or design their platforms differently or just not be able to access maybe a certain segment of the population?
The direct impacts of the age restrictions, I think, are probably pretty small in the short term, right? Maybe longer term if people just don't grow up with that habit of being on these sites. Now, I will say the way potentially that these sites are designed, once they do go on, they are likely to want to continue to stay on. And that's sort of that variable reward reinforcement mechanism that we talk about in the report that's similar to slot machines. So that may be less of an impact directly, right, from regulation. But I do think this cost structure thing is so interesting, right? Because what primarily Section 230 and other doctrines or just assumptions about immunity from the content that's posted on their site has done, as you say, lessened the sort of upfront costs that companies like social media platforms need to pay in order to run a business and earn ad revenue, which is very different to what traditional broadcasters or newspapers have, where they have editorial teams, they're paying journalists up front, they have professional standards that cost money to protect themselves. And that is a big difference in terms of how they've been able to scale and then, apply money back into technological innovations that have enabled these self-service platforms. So if that were to start to shift, maybe you start to see cost structures get closer together. Maybe that would bring CPMs or prices for advertising on these platforms closer together, potentially. I don't think it's an immediate fix, but it makes more sense to me than, say, rules that are sort of targeting a set group of people and then having, say, them pay for news as an add-on, right? Versus kind of fixing the inequity that's at the cause of what we've seen over the last decade or so.
I like your point at the beginning about, the social media addiction trial that happened in California, where you're based. Social media can be harmfully addictive, and there will be more lawsuits that will come, perhaps deciding on whether or not that is the case, but not just for kids, but for anyone of all ages. So I think that point is well taken. I don't want to spend all of our conversation talking about the Strait of Hormuz, but I do need to ask further questions about it. I note that the base case scenario for your report assumes no global recession and a resolution to the Iran conflict. And I understand why that might be your base case, but it doesn't take a Nostradamus to see that the conflict as it stands currently is not any closer to ending than when it began. The quote-unquote ceasefire has been sort of breached I feel like every day since it was apparently declared, and Trump keeps saying the war is over and then not over and then over again, and they're reaching a deal and then they might reach a deal, and there's been sort of no consistency. What happens if the war does continue on, the strait does remain closed? I mean, how soon would you expect that we start to really see the effects of inflation, serious shortages of certain types of products, and what should marketers maybe be considering about that?
Well, you've just described how hard it is to be a forecaster in 2026. That's for sure. This is one of those areas where it's just that without having a line into every single producer of goods and, how are you doing on your plastic pellets? And, how soon are you going to, they're not releasing that kind of information. So it's not my place to say, when are we going to see actual shortages on shelves? But that is what we would sort of be looking for in order to say that there was going to be a significant downgrade in what we're saying, right? We've seen advertising be fairly resilient. I do think the place that breaks down is when there is actual empty shelf, when there are empty shelves, right? And there's nothing to send consumers to go buy in a physical sense. So we haven't reached that yet, at least at a global aggregate level. Again, I know there are going to be certain producers or CPG manufacturers or auto manufacturers who are really struggling with set materials or some shipping, but we don't have evidence enough of it yet for me to put a number on what that looks like this year. So we've included a deceleration for next year. I think some of these effects bleed into next year more than even the tail end of this year because of how strong we started out the year. I think that's going to help us sort of get through and past the second half of this year. But we have said 7.1% next year, so it is a deceleration. And I think we see some of that bleed into the early part of next year.
And also, important to note, that might be felt worse by some markets than others. You would assume sort of poorer countries are already going to be the first ones. I mean, there are already shortages reported in certain countries, but they aren't necessarily large advertising markets.
Yeah, probably more so like those that are more dependent on energy imports rather than like their income level per se. Or those that are reliant on, imported goods, but imported energy for the most part, because that is the greatest sort of price shock right now.
Another downside risk is the labor market, both potentially as inflation spikes and salaries are not necessarily growing at the same pace, but also because of AI. Entry-level jobs have become quite hard in some markets and some industries to come by. You note in the report as well that America's labor share, which, correct me, I've got the correct definition here, the percent of productivity that accrues to workers as compensation is at its lowest level since 1947, which that was a remarkable stat to see show up. Basically, productivity is up and workers are not receiving as much money. Is that fair?
Yeah.
That seems problematic from a marketing standpoint, but also just from a macro perspective.
I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen here. And so what we did in the report was provide a number of scenarios. And just yesterday, it was all over Twitter X and news about how much more radiologists are getting paid now and how many more are needed, even though Jeffrey Hinton and I think others said that was going to be one of the professions that got hit first by AI because it was so good at reading scans, right? But as the cost of scans have gone down, more doctors are ordering scans. And so this is what's known as the Jevons paradox, right? That as a type of technology gets more efficient, you actually have more need for things like coal. The steam engines got more efficient. We needed more coal because more people were using steam engines to do things. And so this is the sort of paradox that we're dealing with. And we just don't know whether we're going to see that kind of future where, AI and its ability to do, cognitive work well alongside humans means that we have lots and lots more cognitive work, or whether it is actually displacing to a greater extent, right? We presented a few different scenarios for this. I'm not willing to stake my claim on just one.
Sure.
Yeah.
If average households do have, let's say, less money to go around due to a variety of factors, could be the labor market, could be being out of a job, could be just inflation versus your salary, or stagflation. Does that change things for your clients? I mean, we talked about the K-shaped economy in December. Do brands start going after increasingly high net worth individuals? Is this good for luxury goods? Is it bad for other types of goods?
I think that's one possibility, right? I think there's one possibility that more activity shifts towards sort of higher value goods, right? And advertising to those individuals. I think one scenario is that efficiency means you can still reach all consumers, maybe via their personal digital assistants. And maybe that looks a little bit different, but you're still messaging to them, right? And they're still buying goods and services that they can. Maybe more as we have more activity happening at a corporate level, right? Maybe more advertising shifts to B2B rather than B2C, which B2B has always been sort of the other half of marketing that I think a lot of people don't talk about as much, right, in the general sense. But maybe more of it shifts there. And we're talking more about reaching those longer sales cycles and high consideration pieces, especially when there's so much going into, again, data centers and software and chips and all the rest of it. So again, I think long term, we're still positing resilience. You may have, and we don't know, things like universal basic income that comes into it, right, to support people. That's been discussed for a long time. We may have even more and more types of goods and services that are provided by corporations that are partially subsidized by advertising, right? We still think that's going to be a primary means of making AI assistance accessible globally, because the cost of that for people to pay subscriptions at the kind of pro level that you see right now is going to be out of reach for, I would say, most of the world's population, right? But what we've seen in the past is that advertising has subsidized these things: communication, photo storage, messaging, all of these things that have, been sort of provided to the world. And we can talk about what's come along with that another time. But, advertising has this role now of sort of helping to provide civic infrastructure in a way. which is why I think we're positive about its long-term role in the future as well.
That's partially because it sounds like civic infrastructure is increasingly privatized, meaning that it's, advertising does support that, but we don't necessarily need to get into all of that and whether that's good for societies. One last big topic that the report notes that you've already brought up as well is China. Dare I say we've entered into the bipolar world. 6 of the top 10 media owners by ad revenue are now Chinese. And the report also notes quite a bit about China's trade surplus and how it's driving a huge amount of the ad expenditure in other markets. Here in the UK, I've seen so many ads for Chinese electric vehicles. I'm sure they're also where you are in the States. And that's
Nope.
just one. Oh, no, there's no?
Nope.
Is that's probably due to tariff policy, isn't it?
They're blocked tariff policy, and they're blocked. There are also laws against electric vehicles with connectivity that send data back to China. Now, Volvo was just recently able to get a waiver for that, and so there's a current question as to sort of whether that opens the door to other Geely brands. Geely now is owner of Volvo, or whether it remains just Volvo, or whether it's all Chinese brands. But yeah, not in the U.S. yet.
Huh. Okay,
Yep.
interesting. Well, I've definitely been bombarded with a couple. We've also talked about Temu, Shein before. How should advertisers be considering China's rise? Because the tech stacks are all different, the laws are all different. As you even note just then, like some of the products may or may not be able to be advertised in certain markets. It sounds like a big headache and something that almost might be one of the defining headaches of the next 5-10 years. Talk me through a little bit how you're viewing it.
So there are a couple of things. First is definitely competitive pressure for incumbent advertisers in markets around the world, right? We've seen this with Jumia, in fact, which is the sort of large African retailer and delivery provider that has faced intense competition from Chinese competitors coming into Africa as well. I think I had to exit some markets basically because of that competition. So that's one, is the investment in the business and probably in advertising to compete with these overseas companies that are now advertising in market. Now that's increasingly interesting in Europe, where you have Joybuy, which is JD's arm, coming in and buying up warehousing space across Europe. And so not just competing by advertising, but also now looking at competing on delivery and logistics with Amazon, quickness and having that warehousing space. So I think what we know is that there is a evidence of the sense that they are going to keep competing globally. And so that's something for advertisers to take on board. And competitors, whether they are sellers of advertising or sellers of goods, right, in all of these markets around the world. It's car manufacturers, it's retailers, it's everyone. The other piece for advertisers is that, yes, you are going to need to figure out how to also advertise on these platforms, right? It's a lot of these PDD, JD, Alibaba, all these, ByteDance, these are all likely going to exist on a sort of separate stack with tech like Huawei and Xiaomi and Alibaba and different models, different chips. And so the orchestration of that and how those platforms work differently, I think, is something that we're looking to help clients with as WPP Media. The orchestration of those two things is going to be very important. And again, as we've seen with expansion, it's not likely going to be just advertisers marketing in China. These platforms are going to be everywhere. And so it's going to be increasingly important, I think, beyond China as well.
And there's been lots of reports of domestic spending in China not necessarily keeping up in the same pace as, ex-China business. Is there any concern in terms of the sustainability of some of the ad expenditure that the Chinese businesses are making elsewhere because of that? Or do you feel like these businesses are truly global businesses and they will probably continue to be some of the biggest spenders for advertising globally in the future?
I think more so the latter. What we're seeing within China is interesting. It's a maturing of the retail market. And so you are seeing some shift from the pure retail model that Alibaba has been known for a long time to more social commerce models that you would see on ByteDance with Douyin or Xiaohongshu, which is Red Note. And so it may even be slightly less consumer demand and consumer behavior shifting that sort of portends where we see these different platforms go. But I think, less as an impact of domestic demand per se, and more so, shifting behaviors and tastes and advertising formats for how we see those businesses growing in China.
We've talked about a whole range of subjects. I'm sure we could keep talking for much longer. I do have one last question. What's one thing that you expect will keep you up at night in H2 this year, and one thing that might make you rest a little easier?
Oh, I mean, an end-to-armed conflict is the easy answer for rest easier. I'll take that one first.
Okay.
The easy one. I'm going to be really closely watching what we learn about generative search as a new channel. I can't believe we didn't even have time to get into that. That'll be another whole episode on its own.
Sure.
But as that is so new, as there's so little historical data to really model off of, that's been one of the most challenging things to forecast in this report. So I'm going to be really sort of watching what we know and whether my number feels like it's still in the right ballpark in 6 months' time or not. I think
sounds like you're generally terrified of being wrong, but that's the whole point of forecasting, is that you're open to a range of cases. You're right, we didn't talk about the whole Gen AI. You have in the full report a new section just for trying to estimate and forecast the money that is now coming in from AI search, which I will also be keeping a very close eye on. Definitely go and read the full report. We'll already have coverage up on the Media Leader, so you can also read our own reporting from the report. But Kate, it's always such a pleasure to chat with you. Big issues, big topics. Hopefully we'll be having a cheerier version of this conversation come December with fewer armed conflicts.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you for listening to the Media Leader podcast. Our executive producer is me, Jack Benjamin. Special thanks to our production partner, Trisonic. You can find all our episodes on the podcast platform of your choice or on our website at uk.themedialeader.com. But do please remember to subscribe to be notified of our next episode. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at The Media Leader to receive daily coverage of all the biggest news stories in media and advertising. From all of us at The Media Leader, I'm Jack Benjamin. See you next time.